Good evening, friends. Tonight we drift back to the Middle Ages to discover how ordinary villagers kept body and spirit warm when winter showed no mercy. We'll explore straw-packed walls, wool layered over linen, and the quiet science of glowing embers sealed inside clay pots, simple methods that often stood between frostbite and another dawn. If slow, story-rich history helps you unwind, feel free to tap like and subscribe, and in the comments, share where you're listening from and what the clock reads in your corner of the world. I'm always amazed by how far this sleepy community reaches. So, dim the lights, let a gentle fan hum if you wish, settle into your pillow, and allow the chill of centuries past to fade as we begin our journey together. Hearth-Smoke and frozen furrows, a peasant's winter dawn. The darkness before dawn in a medieval peasant cottage was absolute, a thick blanket of black that seemed to press against the eyes. In the coldest months, somewhere around the 3rd hour before sunrise, the first stirrings would begin, not from an alarm or a rooster's crow, but from the simple, urgent need for warmth. Imagine yourself there, in that moment when consciousness returns, your breath visible in the frigid air of your own dwelling. The floor beneath you shifts slightly, not wooden planks as you might expect, but packed earth, frozen solid in the depths of January. Above you, the thatched roof, perhaps 2 feet thick with bundled rye straw, creates a barrier between your family and the elements, though you can hear the wind finding every gap, every worn spot where the thatch has thinned. The walls around you are wattle-and-daub, a weaving of hazel or willow branches, packed with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung that has dried and hardened into something surprisingly effective at blocking the worst of the cold. Your bed, if it can be called that, is a simple wooden frame filled with a straw tick, a large sack stuffed with whatever dried plant matter could be gathered in autumn. Rye straw if you were fortunate, wheat straw if you had connections to the manor, or simple meadow grass and dried bracken if times were lean. This mattress, which you share with perhaps 2 or 3 family members, has compressed over the months into a thin but vital layer of insulation between your body and the frozen ground below. The warmth of multiple bodies sleeping close together is not a matter of preference but of survival. As you rise, the first task is always the same, the fire. The hearth, positioned in the center of your single-room dwelling, is the beating heart of winter survival. But starting a fire in winter requires particular skill and patience. The wood, stored in the driest corner of the cottage, is never truly dry in the perpetual dampness of an English or French winter. You must first find the embers, if any remain from the night before, buried deep in the ashes. Using a small knife or a worn stick, you carefully excavate these precious glowing remnants. If the embers have died completely, which happens perhaps once a week despite your best efforts, you must resort to flint and steel or borrow fire from a neighbor, a common practice that strengthens communal bonds through shared necessity. The tinder must be absolutely dry, perhaps some inner bark from a dead tree, carefully prepared and stored in a small leather pouch, or dried fungus from an oak tree, prized for its ability to catch the smallest spark. Once you have a small flame, the real work begins. You feed it first with the thinnest, driest twigs, many of which you've stored under your bed where body heat has driven out the last moisture. Then slightly larger sticks, each one carefully selected and positioned to allow air to flow while sheltering the delicate flame. The smoke, inevitable with damp wood, fills the cottage before finding its way up through the smoke hole in the roof. There are no chimneys in most peasant dwellings until the later medieval period. This smoke, though it stings the eyes and blackens the rafters, serves multiple purposes. It helps preserve the meat and fish hanging from the beams, it discourages insects even in winter, and oddly enough, it helps seal the thatch above as the soot fills tiny gaps. You've grown so accustomed to this smoke that its absence would feel wrong, empty somehow. As the fire grows stronger, other family members begin to stir. Children emerge from their warm cocoons of rough woolen blankets, inherited and patched through generations. These blankets, along with everyone's clothing, are the product of countless hours of spinning and weaving, mostly done by the women of the household during the long winter evenings. Wool is the primary material, sheep being one of the few animals that can provide renewable warmth without being slaughtered. The clothing itself is layered in ways that modern people might find surprising. First, a linen undergarment, if the family can afford it, worn next to the skin and changed perhaps once a week. Over this, a woolen tunic that reaches to the knees, then another if the cold is severe. Women wear similar layers, with a longer tunic called a kirtle. Legs are covered with woolen hose, essentially thick stockings that tie to a belt. In the coldest weather, strips of hay or straw might be stuffed between layers for extra insulation. But here's something that might surprise you. The peasants often share their living space with their animals during winter. This is not merely a matter of protecting valuable livestock from freezing. The body heat of a cow produces as much warmth as a small fire. A family with 2 cows, a pig, and some chickens, all sheltered in a section of the cottage separated by a low partition, benefits from a constant source of animal warmth. The smell, of course, is overwhelming by modern standards, but to medieval peasants it simply smells like winter, like survival. The morning routine continues with remarkable consistency across the centuries. Water must be fetched, often from a well that requires breaking through a layer of ice. The bucket, made of wood bound with iron, is lowered carefully. A broken rope in winter could mean disaster. The water, once retrieved, is precious. Some will be heated for a thin porridge of barley or oats, some saved for the animals, and only a very small amount used for any kind of washing. Breakfast, such as it is, consists of that porridge, perhaps flavored with a small piece of salted pork or a few drops of precious fat. Bread, if available, is dark and dense, made from rye or barley, and often several days old, softened by dunking in the hot porridge. Fresh bread is a luxury reserved for special occasions or the aftermath of baking day, which happens perhaps once a week if fuel allows. The preservation of food through winter is an art form born of necessity. In the rafters hang bundles of onions, their papery skins rustling in the heat-driven air currents. Turnips and parsnips are buried in sand or straw in a corner, where the temperature stays just above freezing. Cabbages, if the family was fortunate enough to grow them, are fermented into something resembling sauerkraut, stored in wooden barrels. Dried peas and beans, the protein source that will see the family through until spring, are kept in clay pots sealed with beeswax. As dawn finally breaks, pale light filters through the cottage's few openings. Windows, if they exist at all, are small and covered with oiled linen or thin-scraped horn. Glass is far beyond a peasant's means. These coverings allow some light while blocking the worst of the wind, though they must be replaced frequently as they deteriorate. The work of winter days begins early. Men venture out to tend to whatever animals remain alive, breaking ice on water troughs, distributing carefully rationed hay. The barn, if the peasant is fortunate enough to have one separate from the house, is often warmer than expected. The fermentation of hay and the body heat of animals creates a microclimate that can be almost comfortable on all but the coldest days. Women's work in winter centers around the hearth and the endless production of textiles. The spinning wheel, if the family owns one, rarely stops turning. More often, though, it's the simple drop spindle that creates the thread, a process so ingrained that women spin while walking, talking, even while watching children. The rhythm of spinning becomes the rhythm of winter life, constant, meditative, productive. Children, even young ones, have their winter tasks. Gathering firewood is endless, dead branches from the common woodland, if the Lord allows it. Each stick must be evaluated for its burning potential, its dryness, its size. Children learn early to identify which wood burns hot and fast, birch, which burns long and steady, oak, and which should be avoided because it spits and sparks, pine. The patching and maintenance of the cottage itself is constant winter work. Every gap in the wattle and daub must be filled before it becomes a channel for freezing wind. Fresh mud is mixed with straw and dung, warmed by the fire if possible, and pressed into cracks with fingers that quickly numb in the cold. The mixture freezes almost as soon as it's applied, but that's actually beneficial. It will thaw and properly cure when the weather warms. The thatch roof requires particular attention. Ice forming under the straw can create gaps that let in not just cold but moisture, the true enemy of winter survival. Using long poles, men push and adjust the thatch, adding new layers where needed, always aware that a poorly maintained roof could mean the difference between discomfort and disaster. Let's pause for a moment to consider the ingenuity of the medieval peasants' approach to insulation. They understood, through generations of experience, principles that wouldn't be scientifically codified for centuries. The use of straw, for instance, takes advantage of trapped air, the same principle used in modern insulation. The practice of banking earth against the lower walls of the cottage before winter, creating a sloped barrier, demonstrates an understanding of thermal mass. Inside the cottage, rush mats cover the earth floor. These mats, woven from rushes gathered in autumn and dried in the rafters, provide a barrier between feet and frozen ground. Fresh rushes are added periodically, the old ones composted or burned. Sometimes aromatic herbs are woven in, not for their pleasant smell, though that's welcome, but for their pest-repelling properties. The organization of space within the cottage reflects the primacy of warmth. Everything centers around the hearth. Cooking, eating, working, socializing, all happen within the circle of heat and light cast by the fire. At night, the family's beds, such as they are arranged as close to the hearth as safety allows. The phrase curfew comes from the French couvre-feu, cover fire, the nightly ritual of banking the fire with ashes to preserve embers while preventing house fires. Water management in winter presents unique challenges, not just the fetching of it, but preventing it from freezing once inside. Wooden buckets are kept near the fire, but not so near that they dry out and develop leaks. Clay vessels, if the family owns any, must be watched carefully. Water expanding as it freezes will shatter pottery. Many a peasant family has learned this expensive lesson. The production and preservation of dairy, for those fortunate enough to own a cow, continues through winter, but at a much reduced rate. Cows produce less milk when cold and on limited feed. What milk there is might be processed into cheese or butter, both of which keep better than fresh milk. The churning of butter is often done by children, the repetitive motion generating its own warmth in frozen fingers. Let me tell you about the sounds of a winter morning in a medieval cottage. The crack and pop of the fire finding pockets of moisture in the wood. The low murmur of morning prayers, for faith is as essential to winter survival as food or warmth. The shuffle of feet in worn leather shoes stuffed with straw. The gentle lowing of cattle on the other side of the partition. The whistle of wind finding its way through the smoke hole. These sounds create a symphony of survival, repeated in countless cottages across the frozen landscape. The question of bathing in winter is one that modern minds often wonder about. The answer is simple: it rarely happens. Full-body washing is dangerous in winter, risking illness from the cold. Instead, peasants practice spot cleaning with warmed water and rough linen cloths. Hands and faces might be washed weekly, if that. The accumulation of dirt and oils on the skin is actually protective, providing an additional barrier against cold. Clothing is rarely washed in winter either. The outer woolen garments are brushed and beaten to remove dirt, then hung near the fire to air out. Linen undergarments, if washed at all, must be dried indoors, adding to the cottage's already high humidity. This moisture, combined with smoke and the presence of animals, creates an atmosphere that would be overwhelming to modern sensibilities but was simply the reality of winter life. The medieval peasant's diet in winter is monotonous but carefully balanced for survival. The primary goal is maintaining body heat, which requires calories, lots of them. A working man in winter might consume 4,000 calories a day if available. Porridge provides the bulk, supplemented with preserved meats, dried fish, and vegetables. Fat is precious and carefully rationed. A spoonful of lard or butter can mean the difference between warmth and cold. The brewing of ale continues through winter, the fermentation process actually benefiting from cooler temperatures. Ale is not just a beverage but a food source, providing calories and nutrients. Even children drink small ale, a weaker version with just enough alcohol to make the water safe. The brewing process itself generates heat, making brew day a relatively warm occasion. As we move through the morning routine, consider the remarkable social cooperation required for winter survival. Peasant families don't survive winter alone. They share resources, labor, and most importantly, warmth. It's common for families to gather in one cottage while others conserve fuel. These gatherings aren't just practical but psychological necessities, maintaining community bonds through the isolating months. The sharing of fire is particularly important. If a family's fire dies completely and cannot be restarted, they must seek live coals from neighbors. This is never refused. To deny fire in winter would be tantamount to murder in the eyes of the community. The person seeking fire brings a small pot or metal container, carefully transporting the glowing embers back to their cold hearth. Let's talk about the peculiar architecture of survival. The cottage's low ceiling, often barely 6 feet high, is intentional. Heat rises, and a lower ceiling means the living space stays warmer. The beams are blackened with centuries of smoke, and herbs hang drying from every available surface. Onions, garlic, medicinal plants, all preserved by the constant smoke and ready for use. The windows, those few that exist, face south when possible, capturing what little winter sun penetrates the gray skies. On the coldest nights, these openings are blocked entirely with boards or thick cloth, plunging the interior into complete darkness save for the fire's glow. The decision of when to block the windows is crucial. Too early and you lose precious daylight, too late and you lose precious heat. Furniture in a peasant cottage is minimal and purely functional. A trestle table that can be dismantled when not in use. A few stools or benches, often just logs with legs attached. Perhaps a chest for storing the family's few valuables and best clothes. Everything is made of wood, worn smooth by generations of use. Metal fixtures are rare and precious. Even nails are valuable enough to be pulled from old wood and reused. The cottage floor tells its own story of winter adaptation. In addition to rush mats, dried bracken and heather might be strewn about, changed periodically as they become soiled. These materials provide insulation and absorb moisture. When they're finally too dirty to keep, they're valuable as animal bedding or compost. Nothing is wasted in the circular economy of peasant life. Storage solutions in winter require creativity. Root vegetables are kept in clamps, mounds of earth and straw in the cottage corner or just outside. Grain, if any remains from the harvest, is stored in the driest part of the cottage, often in the roof space where smoke helps prevent mold and deter rodents. Every family has its secret methods for hiding food from both four-legged and two-legged thieves. The tools of winter survival hang from pegs on the walls. An iron pot, the family's most valuable possession after livestock. Wooden spoons and bowls carved during long winter evenings. A knife or two kept sharp and clean. Perhaps a brass or pewter cup, a treasured heirloom. These simple implements represent the technology of survival, refined over centuries. As morning progresses into day, the cottage warms slightly. The fire has been built up, bodies are moving and generating heat, and if the sun appears, those precious rays angle through the southern window. This might be the warmest the cottage gets all day, perhaps reaching 50 degrees Fahrenheit near the fire. The corners remain frigid, ice sometimes forming on the walls farthest from the hearth. The economics of warmth dictate every decision. Fuel is carefully rationed, perhaps one large log per hour during the day, less at night. The type of wood burned depends on the task at hand. Quick-burning wood for cooking, slow-burning hardwood for nighttime warmth. Peat, if available, burns long but smoky. Coal is known but far too expensive for peasant use. Consider the clothing production that continues throughout winter. The process from sheep to garment is entirely manual. Wool is cleaned, carded with teasels or primitive combs, spun into thread, then woven on simple looms. A single woolen tunic represents hundreds of hours of labor. This is why clothing is patched and repatched, handed down through generations, and mentioned specifically in wills. The repair of shoes is critical winter work. Most peasants wear simple leather shoes, more like slippers, with thin soles that wear quickly. In winter, these might be stuffed with hay or lined with fur from rabbits or squirrels. Wooden clogs, where available, provide better protection from wet and cold, but are uncomfortable for long wear. The fortunate might own patterns, wooden platforms that strap over regular shoes to lift the wearer above mud and snow. Food preparation in winter requires special techniques. With fresh ingredients scarce, flavor comes from preservation methods. Smoking, salting, pickling, each adds its own taste profile. Herbs dried in summer are carefully rationed through winter, a pinch of thyme or sage transforming bland porridge into something almost pleasurable. Wild garlic, preserved in salt, provides both flavor and crucial vitamins. The management of light is as important as heat. Candles are expensive, made from tallow or, for the wealthy, beeswax. Most peasants rely on rushlights, rushes soaked in animal fat that burn with a small, smoky flame. These must be constantly tended, the rush moved through its holder as it burns. A winter evening might consume dozens of rushlights, each providing just enough light for necessary tasks. Let me describe the evening routine as darkness falls early in winter. By 3 or 4 in the afternoon, the light is already fading. Work that requires good vision must be completed. Animals are given their evening feed and secured for the night. The family gathers around the hearth for the main meal of the day. Supper might consist of a stew that's been simmering all day, vegetables, a bit of meat if available, thickened with barley or oats. Bread, if there is any, is used to soak up every drop. Nothing is left on wooden plates or in bowls. After eating, a small amount of warmed water might be used to rinse the dishes, the water then given to the pigs. The long winter evenings are filled with work that can be done by firelight. Men repair tools, carve wooden implements, or weave baskets. Women spin, sew, or knit, though knitting as we know it doesn't become common until the later medieval period. Children might be set to picking seeds from dried flax or combing wool. Stories are told, songs sung quietly, prayers recited. The oral tradition flourishes in winter darkness. Stories of saints and heroes, folk tales and family histories pass from generation to generation. These aren't mere entertainment but education, encoding survival knowledge, moral instruction, and community values. The storyteller's voice, rising and falling with the narrative, becomes part of the hypnotic atmosphere of the winter evening. Games provide distraction from cold and hunger. Simple board games scratched into wood, dice games with bones, riddles and word games that cost nothing but engage the mind. Children play with toys made from scraps, corn husk dolls, spinning tops carved from wood, clay marbles dried by the fire. These activities maintain morale through the darkest months. The preparation for bed is itself a ritual of warmth preservation. The fire is carefully banked, covered with ashes to preserve embers until morning. Stones heated by the fire might be wrapped in cloth and placed in beds. Some families own ceramic bottles that can be filled with hot water, though these are valuable and easily broken. The sleeping arrangements maximize shared body heat. Parents sleep together, children bundled between them or at their feet. Elderly grandparents, producing less body heat, are positioned closest to the banked fire. Dogs, if the family has them, are welcomed into the sleeping pile. Privacy is an unknown luxury. Survival takes precedence over all other considerations. Night in a medieval cottage is profound in its darkness. With the fire banked and no artificial light, the blackness is complete. Every sound is magnified. The settling of the thatch, the breathing of animals, the occasional pop from the embers. Wind rattles the door, finds gaps in the walls, reminds the inhabitants of winter's constant presence. The cold deepens through the night. By morning, frost might form inside the cottage, particularly on metal objects or in corners far from the hearth. Water left in buckets develops a skin of ice. Breath condenses and freezes on beards and the edges of blankets. Yet the human body, remarkable in its adaptation, maintains its core temperature through the miraculous process of metabolism and the simple strategy of huddling together. Sometimes, perhaps once or twice during a long winter night, someone must rise to tend the fire. Moving carefully in the absolute darkness, guided by memory and the faint glow of embers, they add a small log, just enough to ensure the fire doesn't die completely. This person, usually the head of household, performs this task without fully waking, so ingrained is the routine. The cycle of winter days continues with numbing repetition. Each day is a small victory against the cold. Each night survived a testament to human endurance and ingenuity. The peasants don't simply endure winter. They've developed a complex system of survival that uses every available resource, wastes nothing, and binds communities together through shared hardship. Think about the psychological resilience required. Months of cold, darkness, and monotonous food. The constant threat of illness, fire, or starvation. Yet these people maintain hope, continue working, keep their families together. They know that spring will come, as it always has, and with it the renewal of life and warmth. The medieval peasant's relationship with cold is fundamentally different from our modern experience. For us, cold is a temporary discomfort, easily remedied. For them, it was a constant companion for months on end, shaping every decision, every action, every thought. They didn't fight the cold so much as negotiate with it, finding ways to coexist with winter's harsh reality. This negotiation extended to their understanding of the natural world. They knew which birds' behavior predicted storms, which wind directions brought the hardest freezes, which phase of the moon coincided with the deepest cold. This knowledge, accumulated over generations, was as valuable as any material possession. The cottage itself evolved over centuries to meet winter's challenges. Each generation made small improvements: a better door, tighter thatch, a more efficient hearth arrangement. These changes, almost imperceptible year to year, accumulated into a vernacular architecture perfectly suited to its environment and the resources available. As we near the end of this immersion into daily winter life, consider the legacy of these survival strategies. Many techniques developed by medieval peasants continued well into the industrial age. Some, like the use of thermal mass and passive solar heating, are being rediscovered by modern sustainable architecture. The wisdom encoded in their practices wasn't primitive but sophisticated, refined by centuries of practical experience. The medieval peasant's winter day ends as it began, with the careful tending of fire, the preservation of warmth, the gathering of family. Tomorrow will bring the same challenges, require the same vigilance, demand the same cooperation. Yet there's a quiet dignity in this routine, a profound human achievement in the simple act of surviving winter with such limited resources. The smoke continues to rise from the cottage chimney hole, joining countless other pillars of smoke across the frozen landscape. Each represents a family, a hearth, a center of warmth in the vast coldness. Together, they form a constellation of human persistence, points of light and heat in the long darkness of medieval winter. Eleanor the Shepherdess, one woman's battle with the great famine of 1316. The year 1315 brought rains that would not cease. Through spring, summer, and into autumn, the skies poured water onto fields across northern Europe, transforming croplands into swamps, washing seeds from furrows, and beginning what historians would later call the Great Famine. In a small hamlet in Lincolnshire, a young woman named Eleanor watched the disaster unfold with eyes that had already seen too much loss. Eleanor's story, preserved in fragments through manor court records and church documents, offers us a window into how ordinary people navigated extraordinary catastrophe. Born around 1295, she was perhaps 20 years old when the rains began, already a widow, already a survivor. Her childhood had been marked by the usual hardships of peasant life, but nothing had prepared her, or anyone else, for what was coming. Let me paint for you the world Eleanor inhabited before the famine struck. The hamlet of Thornley by the Wold, home to perhaps 40 families, sat on marginal land between the fertile valleys and the sheep-grazing uplands. The soil was thin, rocky in places, productive only through tremendous effort and favorable weather. Eleanor's family held about 15 acres, not enough to be prosperous, too much to be called truly poor. Her father, William the Shepherd, had earned his descriptive surname through generations of family tradition. The keeping of sheep on the common lands, the knowledge of their diseases and remedies, the skill of shearing and the understanding of wool quality, these were the inheritance he passed to his daughter. Her mother, Agnes, had died in childbirth when Eleanor was 7, leaving the girl to learn both women's and men's work. The education of a shepherd's daughter was entirely practical. By age 10, Eleanor could identify every plant that grew on the common, which one's sheep could safely eat, which would sicken them, which might cure various ailments. She knew that yarrow stopped bleeding, that willow bark eased pain, that tansy expelled worms. This knowledge, dismissed by the educated as mere folk wisdom, would soon prove more valuable than gold. Her marriage at 15 to Robert the ploughman was typical, arranged by fathers, blessed by the priest, consummated with hope for a more prosperous future. They had 3 years together before Robert died of a fever that swept through the village in the wet autumn of 1313. No children survived from the union, though Eleanor had carried 2 to term. Both had lived only days, their small bodies unable to fight off the dampness that seemed to seep into everything. By 1315, Eleanor had returned to her father's cottage, taking up her childhood role as shepherdess. The family flock numbered 30 sheep, a respectable holding that provided wool for trade and occasionally meat for the pot. She knew each animal individually, had names for the leaders, could predict weather changes by observing their behavior. When the rains began in earnest that spring of 1315, the older villagers muttered about unusual weather but weren't initially alarmed. Rain in spring was normal, even necessary. But as April turned to May and May to June, and still the rain fell, concern grew into fear. The barley and rye, planted with such hope, began to rot in the fields. The hay, critical for winter fodder, couldn't be cut and dried. Eleanor noticed the changes in the sheep first. Their wool, constantly wet, began to rot on their bodies. Their hooves, never able to fully dry, developed foot rot at an alarming rate. The grass they grazed upon, oversaturated and growing rank, provided little nutrition. By July, the animals were losing weight despite the seeming abundance of pasture. The Manor records from this period, kept by the Reeve Thomas Fitzwalter, provide glimpses of the mounting crisis. Item: 3 sheep dead of the murrain. Item: the hay harvest delayed for want of dry weather. Item: the mill wheel broken by the force of waters. Each entry, written in cramped Latin on precious parchment, documents the slow collapse of agricultural life. Eleanor's father, now in his 50s and considered elderly by medieval standards, relied increasingly on his daughter's energy and knowledge. Together, they made a critical decision that would save not just their flock, but potentially their entire community. Rather than keeping the sheep on the waterlogged common lands, they would organize a rotation system using the slightly higher ground that traditionally was reserved for cattle. This decision required delicate negotiation. The cattle owners, led by the influential John the Reeve, initially resisted, but Eleanor proposed a system that would benefit all. The sheep would graze the high ground for 3 days, then move to allow the cattle access. The sheep's sharper hooves would break up the compacted soil, improving drainage. Their different grazing pattern would prevent any one type of plant from being completely eliminated. The innovation seems simple to modern minds, but it represented a significant break from centuries of tradition. The common lands had always been divided by animal type: sheep here, cattle there, pigs in the woodland. To mix them, even temporarily, required overcoming deep-seated customs and suspicions. As autumn of 1315 arrived with no break in the rain, the situation became desperate. The grain harvest, such as it was, yielded perhaps a quarter of normal. The price of what little grain reached market tripled, then quadrupled. Manor records show that a quarter of wheat, which normally cost 5 shillings, reached 20 shillings by December. Eleanor's knowledge of wild foods became crucial as traditional food sources failed. She organized foraging groups, teaching other women which plants could supplement their dwindling stores. Nettle soup became a staple. The young shoots, picked while wearing woolen mittens to avoid stings, were nutritious and plentiful. Dandelion leaves, bitter but edible, were added to thin pottages. Acorns, normally pig food, were ground into a rough flour after extensive boiling to remove tannins. The Manor court rolls from February 1316 contain an unusual entry. Eleanor, widow of Robert, brought before the court for teaching the gathering of herbs upon the Lord's waste. The Lord, Sir Henry de Vere, initially sought to fine her for unauthorized use of his lands, but the priest, Father Benedict, intervened, arguing that Christian charity demanded allowing the starving to seek sustenance wherever it might be found. What followed was remarkable. Rather than punishing Eleanor, Sir Henry appointed her as overseer of common foraging, a position that didn't exist in law but carried practical authority. She was to organize and regulate the gathering of wild foods, ensuring that no one area was stripped bare, that sustainable practices were followed. The spring of 1316 brought continued rain and new challenges. The stored grain, much of it damp when harvested, began to develop mold. Some families, desperate with hunger, ate it anyway, falling ill with what we now know was ergot poisoning. Eleanor recognized the symptoms, the burning sensations victims described as holy fire, the convulsions, the gangrenous extremities. Her response was both practical and ingenious. She organized the construction of drying platforms in the church, the only building with a proper roof large enough for the purpose. Using techniques learned from her shepherd grandfather, she created smoking fires with specific woods, oak, and apple that would dry the grain while inhibiting mold growth. The church filled with smoke for weeks, but the grain was saved. The human cost of the famine was becoming apparent. The elderly began dying first, voluntarily reducing their food intake to preserve supplies for the young. The Manor records note death after death. The usual fee for registering a death waived propter paupertatem, on account of poverty. Eleanor's flock, managed with extraordinary care, survived better than most. She had learned to identify which sheep could survive on the least food, which ewes would likely produce healthy lambs despite malnutrition. These animals became the breeding stock for the future. The weaker animals were culled early, their meat carefully preserved and distributed according to a system she developed based on family size and need. The distribution system itself reveals Eleanor's organizational abilities. Each family received a portion based on specific criteria: number of children, presence of elderly or sick members, contribution to communal work. The portions were small, perhaps a few ounces of meat per week, but the psychological impact of regular, predictable food distribution cannot be overstated. By summer of 1316, with the famine in its second year, social order was breaking down in many communities. Reports reached Thornley of villages where starving peasants had attacked manor houses, of roads where travelers were robbed not for money, but for any food they might carry. Yet Thornley remained relatively peaceful, held together by the systems Eleanor and others had implemented. The key to this stability was transparency and perceived fairness. Eleanor held weekly meetings in the church where she explained the food situation, the distribution plans, the foraging schedules. Everyone knew what everyone else was receiving. This openness prevented the suspicions and resentments that tore other communities apart. Her medical knowledge, primitive by modern standards but sophisticated for her time, prevented many deaths. When children developed the swollen bellies of malnutrition, she prescribed teas made from specific herbs that, while not curing the underlying hunger, alleviated some symptoms. She recognized scurvy, though she didn't know the term, and insisted that everyone eat some green matter daily, even if it was just grass or tree buds. The psychological support she provided was perhaps as important as the physical remedies. She organized communal singing in the evenings, the voices raised together in hymns and folk songs creating a sense of solidarity. She established a storytelling circle for children, distracting them from hunger with tales of saints and heroes. These activities, requiring no resources but human voice and presence, maintained morale through the darkest periods. The church records provide a fascinating detail from August 1316. Father Benedict notes that Eleanor had organized a feast of herbs for the Assumption of Mary. Every family contributed some gathered plant, whether cultivated or wild, to a communal meal. The resulting stew, stretched with water and flavored with whatever could be found, fed the entire village. More importantly, it reminded them that they were a community, not just a collection of starving individuals. As autumn 1316 approached, there were finally signs of hope. The rains, while still frequent, were less constant. Some fields, those with the best drainage, produced small but viable harvests. The price of grain, while still high, began to stabilize. But Eleanor knew the crisis wasn't over. She organized the preservation of every possible food source for the winter ahead. Her innovation with sheep management had unexpected benefits. The mixed grazing system had prevented the complete destruction of pastures seen in other areas. The sheep, though thin, had developed resistance to foot rot through careful selection. The wool, while of poor quality due to malnutrition, still provided some income when sold to desperate merchants. The winter of 1316 to 1317 was harsh but manageable. The systems Eleanor had put in place, the food distribution, the foraging schedules, the communal support structures, functioned like a well-oiled machine. Deaths occurred, particularly among the very young and very old, but not at the catastrophic rates seen elsewhere. The Manor court records from this period show Eleanor's growing influence. She was called as a witness in disputes, her word carrying weight unusual for a woman of her station. She negotiated with merchants on behalf of the village, her knowledge of wool quality and fair prices preventing exploitation. She even corresponded with other villages, sharing knowledge of survival techniques. One particular innovation deserves special mention. Eleanor developed what she called hunger bread, a mixture of ground acorns, dried grass seeds, and a small amount of actual grain, bound together with blood from slaughtered animals and baked on hot stones. It was barely palatable, but it filled stomachs and provided enough nutrition to prevent starvation. The recipe spread to surrounding villages, copied and modified, but always attributed to Eleanor's wisdom. The spring of 1317 brought the first normal weather in 3 years. The relief was palpable but cautious. Everyone remembered how hope had been crushed before. Eleanor organized the planting with military precision, ensuring that every available seed was used, every fertile plot planted. She mandated diversity. No family could plant only one crop, reducing the risk of total loss. The psychological recovery from the famine took longer than the physical. Many survivors experienced what we might now recognize as post-traumatic stress. They hoarded food obsessively, feared any change in weather, started at the sight of clouds. Eleanor organized what she called Thanksgiving gatherings, where people could share their experiences, their losses, their fears. The demographic impact on Thornley was severe but not catastrophic. Of the 40 families present in 1315, 31 survived intact to 1318. The 9 lost families represented perhaps 50 individuals, a mortality rate of roughly 20%. Terrible by any measure, but significantly better than neighboring villages where mortality reached 40 or even 50%. Eleanor's personal losses were significant. Her father died in the winter of 1316, not from starvation but from a lung infection that his weakened body couldn't fight. She inherited his position as principal shepherd, unusual for a woman but accepted given her proven abilities. She also inherited his small cottage and his debts, which the Manor court agreed to forgive given the circumstances. The recovery period saw Eleanor's role formalized in ways that would have been unthinkable before the crisis. She was appointed to the Manor court as an advisor on agricultural matters. She was given rights to common lands usually reserved for men. She was even consulted by Sir Henry de Vere himself on matters of estate management. Her marriage in 1318 to Thomas the Miller might seem like a conventional ending to her story, but it was actually a strategic alliance. Thomas had survived the famine through his control of the mill, one of the few reliable sources of income during the crisis. Together, they formed an economic partnership that would make them among the more prosperous peasant families in the post-famine period. But Eleanor's true legacy wasn't economic. It was the knowledge she preserved and transmitted. She trained younger women in herb lore, animal husbandry, and crisis management. She had the priest write down many of her remedies and techniques, creating one of the earliest known compilation of peasant survival knowledge. The manuscript, known as the Thornley Herbal, survived in the parish church until the Reformation. While the original is lost, copies and references appear in later medieval texts. Historians have identified at least 12 remedies that can be traced directly to Eleanor's innovations during the famine years. The social changes precipitated by the famine and Eleanor's response to it had long-lasting effects. The rigid separation between men's and women's work began to blur. The idea that communities could organize collectively for survival, rather than depending entirely on Lord's charity, took root. The value of traditional knowledge, previously dismissed by the educated elite, gained new respect. Eleanor lived until approximately 1345, surviving long enough to see another crisis, the beginning of the Black Death. The chronicles suggest she was among those who organized the initial response to the plague in Thornley, applying lessons learned during the famine. Her death, when it came, was noted in the Manor records with unusual detail for a peasant woman. Eleanor, wife of Thomas Miller, wise woman and savior of many during the Great Hunger, died this day of the pestilence. The archaeological evidence from Thornley supports the historical records. Excavations have revealed changes in dietary patterns during the famine years, increased consumption of wild plants, unusual animal bones suggesting desperation food sources, and then a gradual return to normal patterns. The soil layers show the agricultural innovations, the mixing of animal grazing areas, the intensive cultivation of marginal lands. Modern analysis of Eleanor's hunger bread recipe reveals surprising nutritional sophistication. The combination of acorns and grass seeds provided carbohydrates, the blood added iron and protein, and the cooking method preserved more nutrients than conventional baking. It wasn't pleasant eating, but it was scientifically sound survival food. The gender dynamics of Eleanor's story deserve consideration. In normal times, a woman of her station would never have achieved such prominence. The crisis created space for competence to override convention. Yet as soon as normalcy returned, efforts were made to reassert traditional hierarchies. Eleanor's position was explained as exceptional and temporary, though its effects were neither. The economic lessons of Eleanor's approach were studied by later medieval administrators. Her distribution systems influenced how later famines were managed. Her emphasis on transparency and community participation appeared in manor guidelines throughout the 14th century. Though her name was often forgotten, her methods lived on. The spiritual dimension of Eleanor's leadership shouldn't be overlooked. While not overtly religious, she understood the importance of maintaining faith during crisis. She organized prayers and processions, not as empty rituals but as community-building exercises. She interpreted the famine not as God's punishment but as God's test, a subtle but important theological distinction that prevented despair. The networks Eleanor established during the famine persisted for generations. Families she had saved remembered their debt. Young women she had trained passed on her teachings. The communal bonds forged in shared suffering created a resilience that helped Thornley weather future crises better than surrounding communities. As we reflect on Eleanor's story, we see patterns that resonate across centuries. The importance of local knowledge in crisis management. The value of community organization over individual survival strategies. The role of women as preservers and transmitters of essential survival knowledge. These lessons, learned in the mud and hunger of the Great Famine, remain relevant today. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 killed millions across Europe. It was a catastrophe that reshaped society, economy, and culture. But within that vast tragedy were thousands of individual stories of resilience, innovation, and hope. Eleanor the Shepherdess represents all those whose names are mostly lost, whose contributions were essential, whose courage in the face of unprecedented disaster saved communities from complete collapse. Her story reminds us that survival is rarely about individual heroics. It's about collective action, shared knowledge, mutual support. It's about adapting traditional wisdom to new challenges, about finding hope in the darkest circumstances, about maintaining humanity when everything conspires to strip it away. The hamlet of Thornley by the Wold exists today as a small village in Lincolnshire. Few traces remain of the medieval settlement. But in the parish church, a small plaque installed by Victorian antiquarians reads simply, "In memory of those who survived the Great Famine through wisdom, courage, and community." No individual names are listed, but Eleanor's spirit pervades that memorial. The hidden physics of medieval bedding, straw ticks, rush mattresses, and clay bed warmers. In the darkness of a medieval winter night, when temperatures inside a peasant cottage could drop near freezing, the difference between life and death often lay in the humble construction of a bed. Not the wooden frame, which was luxury many didn't possess, but the materials that cushioned and warmed the sleeping body. These materials, chosen through centuries of trial and error, reveal a sophisticated understanding of thermodynamics that wouldn't be scientifically explained for hundreds of years. Let us begin with the most fundamental component of medieval bedding, the straw tick. The word tick comes from the Latin theca, meaning a case or covering. This was essentially a large cloth sack, sewn from whatever fabric could be spared, often worn-out clothing patched together, or rough hemp cloth. But the magic wasn't in the container, it was in what filled it. Straw, that most humble of agricultural byproducts, possesses remarkable properties that medieval people understood intuitively. Each hollow stem creates a tiny pocket of trapped air. Air, when still, is one of nature's best insulators. Modern scientists tell us that air has a thermal conductivity of 0.024 watts per meter Kelvin, compared to 0.6 for water. Medieval peasants didn't know these numbers, but they knew that dry straw kept them warmer than almost anything else available. The selection of straw was not random. Rye straw was preferred when available, its stems longer and more robust than wheat, maintaining their structure better under the weight of sleeping bodies. Barley straw, softer and more pliable, was comfortable but compressed quickly, losing its insulative properties. Oat straw fell somewhere between, acceptable but not ideal. The truly poor might use hay, dried grass, but this compressed even faster and provided less insulation. The preparation of straw for bedding was an art in itself. After threshing removed the grain, the straw was spread in the sun during the last warm days of autumn. It needed to be completely dry, Any moisture would lead to mold, rot, and the dangerous lung infections that claimed so many medieval lives. Once dried, it was beaten with flails to remove any remaining seeds and to break the stems into lengths of about 6 to 12 inches. The physics of why this length mattered is fascinating. Too long, and the straws would align parallel to each other, creating channels for heat to escape. Too short, and they would pack too densely, eliminating the crucial air pockets. The ideal length allowed the straws to create a chaotic matrix, each stem crossing others at various angles, maintaining maximum airspace even under compression. The filling of a straw tick required specific technique. The straw couldn't simply be stuffed in randomly. It was layered, with each layer laid perpendicular to the last, creating a cross-hatched structure that resisted compression. A properly filled tick for a single adult required approximately 40 pounds of straw, creating a mattress perhaps 8 inches thick when new. But here's where medieval innovation becomes apparent. They discovered that mixing different materials with the straw could enhance its properties. Dried bracken fern, with its slightly springy fronds, added resilience. Heather, where available, provided a pleasant scent and possessed mild antiseptic properties. Lady's bedstraw, a plant whose very name reveals its purpose, was prized for its ability to repel fleas and other insects. The science behind these additions is remarkable. Bracken contains compounds called tranquilicides which, while toxic if ingested, have antimicrobial properties when dried. Heather contains tannins that discourage insect infestation. Lady's bedstraw contains coumarin, the same compound that gives new-mown hay its sweet smell, which acts as a natural insect repellent. The maintenance of a straw tick was constant work. Every morning, the tick was shaken and turned to redistribute the filling. Every few days, it was taken outside and beaten with sticks to break up compressed areas and allow air back into the structure. Monthly, if weather permitted, it was opened and the straw spread in the sun to dry any accumulated moisture from body perspiration. The replacement cycle was critical for health. In prosperous households, straw was changed quarterly. For most peasants, twice yearly was more common, at harvest when fresh straw was available, and in late spring when the old straw could be composted for gardens. The old straw, compressed and infused with human scents, was never wasted. It made excellent garden mulch or animal bedding. Let's examine the thermal efficiency of a straw tick more closely. A human body at rest generates approximately 100 watts of heat. In a modern bed with synthetic insulation, perhaps 20% of this heat is lost to the environment. In a medieval straw tick, the loss could be as high as 40%, but this was still a vast improvement over sleeping on bare ground, where heat loss could exceed 70%. The compression factor is crucial to understanding medieval bedding. Fresh straw compresses by about 50% in the first week of use. After a month, it might be compressed to 30% of its original volume. This compression actually improved its insulative properties to a point, creating a denser barrier while maintaining air pockets. But beyond about 25% compression, the insulation value dropped dramatically. Now let us turn to rush mattresses, an alternative or supplement to straw ticks. Rushes, plants that grow in wetlands, provided different properties. The common bulrush, Typha latifolia, was most prized. Its stems are filled with a spongy material called parenchyma, specialized tissue containing up to 60% air by volume. This made rushes even better insulators than straw, though they were harder to harvest and prepare. The harvesting of rushes was typically done in late summer when water levels were low. The rushes were cut near the base, leaving enough root for regeneration. They were then laid out in the sun, turned daily for even drying. This process could take 2 weeks, during which the rushes had to be protected from rain. Any moisture retention would lead to rapid decay once used as bedding. The construction of a rush mattress differed from a straw tick. Rather than being stuffed into a bag, rushes were often woven or plaited into mats. This technique, requiring considerable skill, created a firmer sleeping surface that maintained its shape better than loose straw. The weaving pattern, typically a simple over-under pattern but sometimes more complex diagonal weaves, affected both comfort and insulation. The thermal properties of rush mats are intriguing. The parenchyma tissue not only provides insulation but also manages moisture. It can absorb up to 30% of its weight in water vapor without feeling damp, then release this moisture when conditions change. This helped regulate the humidity in the immediate sleeping environment, reducing the clammy feeling that often accompanied winter nights. Some communities developed hybrid systems. A rush mat would form the base layer, providing firm support and primary insulation. Over this would be placed a thinner straw tick for softness. Sometimes a third layer of loose hay or dried grass would be added on the coldest nights, creating a multi-layer insulation system remarkably similar to modern sleeping bag design. The positioning of beds to maximize the effectiveness of these materials was crucial. Beds were placed away from external walls where possible, avoiding the coldest surfaces. In single-room cottages, beds might be arranged around the central hearth in a spoke pattern, each catching some radiant heat. The height of the bed from the ground mattered too. Cold air sinks, so even raising the sleeping surface a few inches made a difference. Now we must discuss one of the most ingenious medieval warming devices, the ceramic bed warmer. These ranged from simple clay pots to elaborate ceramic bottles, but all operated on the same principle. Thermal mass, the ability of a material to store and slowly release heat. Clay, with its high specific heat capacity of about 920 joules per kilogram per degree Celsius, was ideal for this purpose. The simplest bed warmers were unfired clay balls, about the size of modern softballs. These were placed near the fire during the evening, absorbing heat. When wrapped in cloth and placed in the bed, they would release this heat slowly over several hours. The temperature gradient was gentle enough not to burn, but warm enough to create a pocket of comfort in the cold bed. More sophisticated were the ceramic bottles, fired in kilns to create waterproof vessels. These could be filled with hot water, sand, or even grain. Water provided the most heat capacity, 4,186 joules per kilogram per degree Celsius, but carried the risk of breakage and scalding. Sand was safer and retained heat longer, though it provided less total warmth. Grain, particularly rye or wheat, offered a middle ground. The physics of heat transfer in these bed warmers is worth examining. The rate of heat loss follows Newton's law of cooling. The rate is proportional to the temperature difference between the object and its environment. By wrapping the warmer in layers of cloth, medieval people created additional insulation, slowing heat loss and extending warming time from perhaps 2 hours to 6 or more. Some regions developed specialized ceramic warmers with interior chambers. The outer chamber held water or sand, while an inner chamber could hold herbs or aromatic materials. As the warmer cooled, it would release not just heat but pleasant or medicinally beneficial vapors. Lavender for relaxation, thyme for respiratory ailments, rosemary for mental clarity. The manufacture of these ceramic warmers reveals surprising sophistication. Clay was selected for its thermal properties. Not all clays are equal. Those with higher iron content retained heat better, but were more prone to cracking. The addition of ground shells or sand as temper improved thermal shock resistance. The firing temperature, typically around 900 degrees Celsius in medieval kilns, was crucial for durability. Archaeological excavations have revealed numerous broken bed warmers, allowing us to study their construction. Wall thickness was typically 8 to 10 millimeters, thick enough for strength, thin enough for efficient heat transfer. Many show evidence of repeated repair with lead or tin, indicating their value. Some bear makers' marks, suggesting specialized production rather than household manufacture. The placement of bed warmers followed specific patterns. They were typically positioned at the foot of the bed an hour before sleeping, creating a warm zone for cold feet. Some people preferred them at the small of the back, others near the stomach. The wealthy might use multiple warmers, creating zones of heat throughout the bed. The positioning was never random but based on individual health needs and preferences. Stone bed warmers represent another category. Certain stones, particularly soapstone and slate, have excellent thermal properties. Soapstone can hold twice as much heat by volume as clay. These stones were often family heirlooms, passed down through generations, their surfaces worn smooth by countless nights of use. Some were carved with religious symbols or family marks. The danger of bed warmers was real and recognized. Manor court records occasionally mention fires started by improperly used warmers. Burns from cracked ceramic or overly hot stones were common winter injuries. Some communities developed safety protocols. Warmers had to be tested with a drop of water if it sizzled violently, too hot, and wrapped in specific materials. The interaction between bed warmers and bedding materials created microclimates. The warm zone would cause localized air circulation within the straw tick, distributing heat more evenly. Moisture from the body would migrate toward the heat source, potentially creating damp spots. Understanding and managing these dynamics required experience passed down through generations. Let's consider the mathematical efficiency of medieval warming strategies. A ceramic bottle containing 2 liters of water at 60 degrees Celsius contains approximately 250 kilojoules of thermal energy above room temperature. Released over 6 hours, this provides about 12 watts of continuous heating, not much by modern standards, but in the insulated environment of a properly made bed, enough to maintain comfort. The use of multiple insulation strategies, the principle of layering, shows intuitive understanding of thermal resistance. Each layer of material adds its R-value, thermal resistance, to the total. A straw tick might provide R2, a woolen blanket R1, a second blanket another R1. Combined, this R4 rating is comparable to modern sleeping bags rated for freezing temperatures. Regional variations in bedding reveal adaptation to local climates and materials. In Scotland, heather was predominant. In maritime areas, dried seaweed provided both insulation and beneficial iodine vapors. Mountain communities used pine needles, which contain pinene, a mild decongestant. Each region optimized based on available materials and specific needs. The seasonal adjustment of bedding was systematic. Summer bedding might be just a thin straw tick with minimal filling. As autumn progressed, layers were added. First more straw, then rush mats, then additional covers. By deep winter, a bed might contain 5 times the insulation of summer. This gradual transition helped bodies adapt to changing temperatures. The communal aspects of bedding preparation strengthened social bonds. Straw-filling parties were social events, particularly for newlyweds setting up household. Women would gather to sew new ticks, sharing techniques and materials. The annual replacement of bedding straw coincided with harvest festivals, linking comfort with agricultural success. Medieval understanding of ventilation in bedding deserves mention. They recognized that completely sealed bedding led to dampness and disease. Ticks were deliberately made with loose weaves that allowed some air exchange. The practice of airing bedding daily, even in winter, shows understanding of moisture management that wouldn't be scientifically explained until the development of building science. The role of bedding in disease transmission was partially understood. The regular replacement of straw, the use of insect-repelling herbs, the sunning of materials, all show awareness of hygiene's importance. While they attributed disease to bad airs or corrupt humors, their practical responses were often effective. Archaeological evidence from medieval sites reveals fascinating details. Microscopic analysis of preserved bedding fragments shows not just the plant materials used, but also pollens, insect remains, and even DNA from the sleepers. These studies confirm historical accounts and sometimes reveal practices not recorded in written sources. The economic value of good bedding is reflected in legal documents. We'll specifically mention bed ticks and warmers. Marriage contracts list bedding among essential dowry items. Court records show disputes over stolen or damaged bedding. A well-made straw tick might represent a month's labor in value. The gendered division of bedding labor was complex. While women typically managed daily maintenance, men often handled the heavy work of filling and turning ticks. Children gathered materials like ladies' bed straw and heather. Elderly family members, their knowledge precious, directed preparation and taught techniques. Monastic communities developed some of the most advanced bedding systems. Not bound by poverty like peasants, but committed to simplicity, they experimented with optimal designs. Monastery records describe detailed specifications for bedding, exact straw lengths, specific mixing ratios, prescribed maintenance schedules. These communities served as centers of innovation. The transition from medieval to early modern bedding practices was gradual. The introduction of cotton, the development of better weaving techniques, the availability of coal for heating, all slowly changed sleeping arrangements. But even into the 19th century, rural communities maintained many medieval practices, testament to their effectiveness. Modern experiments with reconstructed medieval bedding have validated historical accounts. Volunteers sleeping in accurately recreated straw ticks report surprising comfort once accustomed to the firmness. Thermal imaging shows effective heat retention. The biggest difference from modern bedding is the need for daily maintenance, the active management medieval people took for granted. The psychological aspects of medieval bedding shouldn't be overlooked. The nightly ritual of preparing the bed, the seasonal rhythm of changing materials, the sensory experience of fresh straw or herbs, all contributed to sleep hygiene in ways we're only beginning to appreciate. The connection between physical comfort and mental well-being was understood, even if not articulated in modern terms. As we conclude this exploration of medieval bedding, consider the profound human ingenuity it represents. Without understanding the scientific principles, medieval people created effective solutions to fundamental challenges. They transformed plant waste into comfort, clay into warmth, knowledge into survival. Their beds were not just places to sleep, but technologies of survival, refined over centuries of cold nights. The next time you settle into your modern bed with its synthetic materials and electric heating, spare a thought for those who came before. They faced winter nights with straw and clay, rush and stone, and through observation, experimentation, and shared wisdom, they created comfort from virtually nothing. Their legacy lives on, not in the specific techniques, but in the human drive to create warmth and comfort against the cold darkness. Fireside feasts in the Manor hall, when cold was merely a view outside the tapestry. While Eleanor the shepherdess rationed nettle soup and peasants huddled with their livestock for warmth, a different winter entirely unfolded behind the thick stone walls of England's manor houses. Here, in spaces that would seem vast even by modern standards, the medieval nobility experienced cold as an aesthetic backdrop rather than an existential threat. Let us step through the heavy oak doors of a typical manor hall, circa 1350, and observe how the other 5% lived when frost painted the windows and snow buried the peasant cottages. The great hall of Wickham Manor rises 40 feet to its apex, the hammer-beam roof a masterpiece of medieval engineering that creates a space both grand and surprisingly warm. The walls, 3 feet thick and built from local limestone, provide massive thermal inertia. Once warmed, these stones hold heat for days, radiating it gently back into the space like a giant storage heater. The principle is the same as the peasant's clay bed warmer, but on an architectural scale. At the far end of the hall, a fireplace large enough to roast a whole ox dominates the wall. This is not the smoking central hearth of a peasant cottage, but a properly designed chimney system, its flue drawing smoke up and away while maintaining a powerful draft that feeds the flames. The fireplace opening stands 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall, its limestone hood carved with the family's heraldic beasts. The andirons, massive iron sculptures in their own right, support logs that would take 4 men to carry. The fire burning here consumes in a single day what would heat a peasant cottage for a month. Oak logs, aged for 2 years until perfectly dry, burn with intense heat and little smoke. The Lord's Woodward manages a forest specifically for this purpose, selecting trees, overseeing cutting, directing the seasoning process. The Christmas season alone might consume 50 full-grown oaks. Above the fireplace, the family's arms are carved in stone, painted in bright heraldic colors that glow in the firelight. To either side hang tapestries, not mere decorations but functional insulation. These woven pictures, depicting scenes from romance literature or biblical stories, cost more than a peasant village might produce in a decade. Behind them, a gap of several inches creates dead air space, another layer of insulation. The tapestries themselves deserve closer examination. Woven in Flanders from the finest wool, they incorporate silk threads that catch and reflect light. The scenes they depict, perhaps the siege of Troy or the hunt of the unicorn, provide visual entertainment during long winter evenings, but their primary purpose is warmth. They block drafts, absorb and retain heat, and create smaller, more manageable spaces within the vast hall. The floor presents a striking contrast to the packed earth of peasant dwellings. Here, fitted stones create a smooth surface, worn to a polish by generations of feet. Beneath these stones, in the most advanced manor houses, run hypocaust systems inherited from Roman design. Hot air from basement furnaces flows through channels under the floor, warming the stones from below. Walking barefoot here in winter is not only possible but pleasant. Fresh rushes cover the floor, but these are not the simple meadow grass of peasant homes. These are selected rushes, cut at the optimal time, dried perfectly, and mixed with aromatic herbs. Lavender, rosemary, thyme, and meadowsweet create a pleasant fragrance when crushed underfoot. Changed weekly rather than seasonally, these rushes never develop the fetid smell associated with poorer dwellings. The high table, where the Lord's family dines, sits on a raised platform called a dais. This elevation serves multiple purposes. It reinforces social hierarchy, provides better views of entertainment, and most practically, places the diners in the warmer air that rises to fill the upper portion of the hall. The table itself, made from a single massive oak plank, has been polished with beeswax until it gleams like dark honey. Behind the high table, a massive cloth of estate hangs from the wall. This textile backdrop, changed seasonally, might be wool in winter, silk in summer. The winter hanging is typically dark blue or deep red, colors that psychologically suggest warmth. Embroidered with gold thread that catches the firelight, it creates an almost theatrical setting for the Lord's presence. Let us observe a typical winter evening feast. The preparations begin hours before sunset. Servants stoke not just the great hall fire but auxiliary fires in side chambers. Braziers, metal baskets on legs that hold burning charcoal, are positioned throughout the hall. These provide localized heat for guests and can be moved as needed. The charcoal, specially made from hardwood, burns hot and clean, without the smoke that would irritate noble sensibilities. The kitchen, a separate building connected to the hall by a covered passage, bustles with activity. Here, 3 separate fireplaces allow different cooking methods simultaneously. The roasting hearth has mechanical spits turned by a dog running in a wheel, or, in grander establishments, by the power of rising hot air turning a turbine. The boiling hearth supports massive cauldrons where stews and sauces simmer. The baking oven, built into the wall, maintains steady heat for bread and pastries. The menu for a winter feast reveals the vast gulf between noble and peasant tables. While peasants subsist on preserved vegetables and occasional salted meat, the noble table groans under abundance. A first course might include venison soup enriched with wine and exotic spices, pepper from India, cinnamon from Ceylon, cloves from the Spice Islands. These spices, worth literally their weight in silver, flavor dishes that would seem alien to the peasants laboring in the fields outside. The main courses proceed in careful order. Roasted meats dominate. Beef from cattle fed through winter on hay the peasants desperately need. Pork from pigs fattened on acorns the poor might grind for flour. Mutton from sheep whose wool alone would clothe a peasant family. Each meat is accompanied by sauces that demonstrate culinary sophistication. A green sauce of parsley and vinegar, a camelline sauce of cinnamon and ginger, a yellow sauce of saffron and egg yolks. Game meats provide variety and display the Lord's hunting rights. Venison, so strictly controlled that poaching carries the death penalty, appears in multiple forms. Roasted haunches, pies of minced meat, sausages flavored with wine and herbs. Wild boar, dangerous to hunt and thus prestigious to serve, might be presented with its head reconstructed, tusks gilded, an apple in its mouth. Smaller game, rabbits, hares, various birds, fill the spaces between larger dishes. The consumption of birds reaches almost absurd proportions. Swans, peacocks, herons, cranes all grace the noble table. The peacock might be served in its pride, the meat cooked and then redressed in its feathers, the tail spread in full display. Smaller birds are nested inside larger ones, a quail in a partridge in a chicken in a goose, creating elaborate constructions that demonstrate kitchen skill. Fish dishes, essential for the numerous fast days even nobles must observe, show similar excess. Fresh fish in winter, when peasants make do with dried or salted varieties, requires either proximity to the coast or elaborate preservation methods. Live fish transported in barrels of water, their survival a mark of the Lord's resources. Pike, bream, and carp from managed fish ponds. Salmon and sturgeon from distant rivers. Even dolphins and porpoises, classified as fish by medieval logic, might appear. The vegetables at the noble table, while not the focus, surpass anything available to peasants. Fresh greens grown in protected gardens, their growth forced by glass cloches and warm walls. Onions stored in perfect conditions, still crisp and pungent. Dried fruits, raisins, dates, figs imported from the Mediterranean. Almonds, used in everything from main dishes to desserts, ground into milk for fast days. Sugar, that ultimate luxury, appears in forms that would bankrupt a peasant family. Sculpted sugar subtleties, edible artworks depicting castles, ships, or mythical beasts, serve as entertainment between courses. Candied fruits, their natural sweetness intensified. Wafers rolled with honey and spices. Hippocras, wine sweetened and spiced, served warm in winter as a digestive. The presentation of food becomes theater. Dishes arrive in procession, announced by fanfares. The Lord's cupbearer, a position of honor, tastes wine before serving, both for safety and ceremony. The carver, trained in the elaborate ritual of meat division, performs his art before the assembled company. Each cut has a name, each portion a designated recipient based on complex social hierarchy. Between courses, entertainment maintains the festive atmosphere. Minstrels perform in the gallery, their music drifting down to the diners. Acrobats and jugglers provide visual spectacle. A storyteller might recount heroic tales or romantic adventures. In the most elaborate feasts, mummers perform short plays, their costumes glittering in the firelight. The clothing worn at these winter feasts represents wealth that could feed entire villages. The Lord wears a houpeland, a long robe with elaborate dagged sleeves, made from wool so fine it feels like silk. Underneath, layers of linen and silk provide warmth without bulk. The outer robe might be lined with fur ermine for the highest nobility, showing white with black spots, or vair, alternating gray and white squirrel pelts arranged in patterns. The lady's clothing is equally elaborate. Her gown, cut from yards of expensive fabric, trails behind her, requiring a servant to carry the train. The sleeves, so long they nearly touch the ground, are lined with fur that peeks out at the openings. Her headdress, perhaps a tall hennin or an elaborate arrangement of veils, requires careful balance. Jewels sparkle at throat, fingers, and waist, each gem representing acres of peasant labor. The contrast extends to personal hygiene. While peasants rarely bathe in winter, the noble chambers include dedicated spaces for washing. A fireplace heats the chamber where a wooden tub, lined with linen sheets, awaits. Hot water, carried by servants from the kitchen, fills the tub. Rose petals or aromatic herbs float on the surface. The bather, attended by servants, luxuriates in warmth impossible for common folk. After bathing, the noble body is dried with linen towels warmed by the fire. Oils and perfumes, imported at great expense, are applied to skin and hair. Clean clothing, stored in chests with aromatic herbs to maintain freshness, replaces what was worn. The soiled clothing goes to laundresses who will wash, dry, and press it, a process taking days in winter. The sleeping chambers of the nobility present another stark contrast. The great bed, a piece of furniture worth more than a peasant's entire holding, dominates the space. Four posts support a canopy from which hang heavy curtains that can be drawn to create a warm, private space. The mattress, rather than straw, contains feathers, thousands upon thousands of goose and duck feathers, carefully cleaned and dried. Above the feather mattress lies another of down, the softest under feathers that provide incomparable comfort. Sheets of fine linen, possibly imported from France or Flanders, smooth and cool to the touch. Blankets of wool so finely woven they're nearly weightless yet remarkably warm. A coverlet of silk or velvet, embroidered with the family arms, tops the arrangement. The bed hangings serve both practical and symbolic purposes. Heavy wool or velvet in winter, they block drafts and retain body heat. Their colors, often deep reds or blues, create a sense of warmth. Embroidered with gold and silver thread, they display wealth even in the private chamber. Some hangings tell stories, biblical scenes, romantic tales, or family history, providing contemplation during wakeful moments. The warming of noble beds follows elaborate ritual. Servants use warming pans, brass pans with long handles, filled with coals, to heat the sheets before the Lord retires. These pans, decorated with pierced designs that create patterns of light, move systematically across the bed. The process might take half an hour, ensuring no cold spots remain. In addition to the main fireplace, the bedchamber might have smaller, more efficient heating. A corner fireplace with a hood that directs heat into the room rather than up the chimney. Charcoal braziers that can burn safely through the night. In the most luxurious establishments, ceramic stoves imported from Germany, their elaborate tiles storing and slowly releasing heat. The morning routine in a noble household begins long before the Lord rises. Servants enter quietly to build up fires that have burned low overnight. They warm clothing on wooden stands near the fire. Fresh washing water is heated and scented. The Lord rises to a room already comfortable, dresses in pre-warmed clothing, washes with warm water, comfort unimaginable to those shivering in cottages below. The private chapel, present in most manor houses, maintains warmth for daily devotions. A small fireplace or brazier takes the chill off. Cushioned kneelers protect noble knees from cold stone. The priest, saying Mass in Latin the congregation barely understands, wears vestments lined with fur. Even spiritual observance is softened by wealth. Let us consider the manor's water systems. While peasants break ice to get water, the manor might have indoor wells, protected from freezing. Some advanced houses have primitive plumbing, lead pipes carrying water from springs to indoor basins. The garderobes, toilets, are built into the walls, their shafts carrying waste away from living spaces. Some even have heating, a brazier below the seat providing warmth to the noble posterior. The wine cellar represents another luxury. While peasants drink small ale by necessity, nobles choose from varieties of wine. French clarets, German Rhenish, sweet Malmsey from Greece. These wines, stored at constant temperature in stone cellars, are warmed before serving in winter. Mulled with spices and honey, they provide internal warmth unattainable for common folk. The intellectual pursuits of winter evenings highlight social divisions. While peasants preserve knowledge through oral tradition, nobles read books, impossibly expensive hand-copied manuscripts. A single book might cost more than a peasant farm. The library, if the manor has one, is heated and lit for reading. The Lord might own dozens of books, romances, histories, religious texts, each representing months of scribal labor. The education of noble children continues through winter in heated chambers. Tutors, often clerics, teach Latin, mathematics, rhetoric. Boys learn swordplay in the hall, their exercises keeping them warm. Girls learn embroidery, music, languages, accomplishments that mark their status. Meanwhile, peasant children gather firewood with frozen fingers. The medical care available to nobles defies comparison. When illness strikes, physicians trained at universities attend. They prescribe elaborate remedies, compounds of rare herbs, powders of precious stones, electuaries of sugar and spice. The sick room is kept warm, the patient comfortable. Contrast this with peasants dying of treatable ailments for want of basic care. The social activities of noble winter reveal privileged isolation. Visits between manor houses require elaborate preparation. Guests arrive with retinues of servants, their comfort ensured by portable furniture, tapestries, even dismantled beds. The receiving household demonstrates hospitality through excessive warmth, fires in every room, heated wine constantly available, entertainment day and night. The Christmas season at the manor reaches heights of excess. The Yule log, a tree trunk so massive it requires a team to move it, burns for the full 12 days. Every meal becomes a feast. Gifts of gold, silver, precious fabrics flow between family members. The Lord of Misrule presides over revelries that temporarily invert social order, but only within the noble class. Music fills the winter manor. Professional musicians, retained for the season, perform daily. Instruments impossible for peasants to afford, lutes, harps, early keyboards provide sophisticated harmony. The lord and lady might play instruments themselves, their education including musical training, dancing in the hall, bodies warm from exertion and wine, while outside peasants huddle for basic survival. The hunting traditions of noble winter deserve mention. While peasants are forbidden to take game under penalty of mutilation or death, nobles hunt for sport. Winter hunts, the ground frozen and tracked with snow, provide excitement and fresh meat. The hunters return to warm halls, hot baths, celebratory feasts. The very activity that would save peasant lives becomes noble entertainment. The legal proceedings of winter manor courts show the gulf between classes. The lord sits in judgment, warmed by furs and fires, while peasants stand in the cold awaiting their cases. Fines that represent minor inconvenience to nobles destroy peasant families. The warmth of mercy seldom extends from the heated hall to the frozen courtyard where commoners wait. Fashion changes among nobles even within winter. While peasants wear the same patched garments year after year, nobles might have multiple winter wardrobes. Different occasions require different displays of wealth. The constant acquisition of new clothing, furs, jewels maintains the economic disparity that keeps peasants laboring. The economic structure that maintains noble comfort depends entirely on peasant labor. The fires that warm the manor consume wood cut by peasant hands. The food comes from peasant fields. The wealth displayed in clothing and jewels derives from rents, taxes, and labor obligations that keep peasants at subsistence level. Every comfort in the manor represents deprivation in the cottage. Yet we must note that noble privilege came with obligations, at least in theory. The lord was supposed to provide protection, justice, and charity. Some lords did distribute alms, especially in hard winters. Some opened their halls for feast days. But these gestures, while meaningful to recipients, didn't fundamentally alter the vast inequality. The manor house's very architecture embodies social hierarchy. The height of ceilings correlates with social importance. Highest in the great hall, lower in servants' quarters. The thickness of walls decreases as one moves from lords' chambers to servants' quarters. Even heat distribution follows social lines. The best fires for the family, smaller fires for important servants, no fires for the lowest workers. The storage facilities of the manor ensure comfort through the longest winter. Vast cellars hold preserved foods, wines, alish. Granaries store enough grain for years. Smoke houses preserve meats. Ice houses, packed with winter ice and insulated with straw, maintain cold storage. This abundance, visible to hungry peasants, reinforces social order through demonstration of power. Consider the pets of the nobility, better fed than many peasants. Hunting dogs sleep by fires, eat meat daily, receive medical attention when sick. Lap dogs, purely decorative, wear jeweled collars worth annual peasant incomes. Exotic animals, peacocks, swans kept for display, consume grain while humans hunger. The contrast is so stark it seems almost designed to emphasize inequality. The written records of noble life reveal casual indifference to peasant suffering. Letters complain of minor inconveniences, a drafty window, wine not properly warmed, while chronicles note without emotion that dozens of peasants froze to death. Account books meticulously record expenses for spices and silk, while noting increased mortality among tenants as merely affecting revenue. The technological innovations that might ease general suffering remain confined to noble use. Glass windows, chimney designs, improved heating methods, all stay within manor walls. The knowledge exists to improve peasant housing, but economic and social structures prevent its distribution. Comfort remains a carefully guarded privilege. As winter nights deepen, the contrast becomes most stark. In the manor hall, fires blaze, music plays, laughter echoes from well-fed throats. Stories are told of adventure and romance. Wine flows freely, warming from within. The greatest concern might be which fur-lined robe to wear tomorrow. Meanwhile, in cottages across the estate, families huddle together for warmth. They've banked their small fires to preserve fuel. Dinner was thin porridge with perhaps a small piece of preserved meat. They'll rise before dawn to tend animals, break ice, gather wood. Their survival through winter is uncertain, depending on factors beyond their control. The social revolution that would eventually challenge this disparity was still centuries away. For now, in our medieval winter, the inequality stands as solid as the manor's stone walls. The noble class, perhaps 2% of the population, consumes resources that could comfort hundreds. They do so without guilt, seeing their privilege as divinely ordained. Yet we must be careful not to impose modern sensibilities entirely. Medieval nobles genuinely believed in the great chain of being, the divine ordering of society. Their comfort wasn't seen as theft, but as natural right. The peasants, for their part, largely accepted this order, their resistance taking the form of poaching, petty theft, and occasional riot rather than systematic revolution. The manor house in winter stands as a monument to human capacity for both comfort and callousness. Within its walls, medieval civilization reached heights of luxury, culture, and refinement. Yet this achievement rested entirely on the suffering of the many for the comfort of the few. The warmth of the manor hall was fueled not just by wood, but by the systematic exploitation of human labor. As we conclude this examination of noble winter comfort, the sound that perhaps best encapsulates the contrast is laughter. In the manor hall, it rings freely, laughter at entertainment, at conversation, at the simple joy of comfort and abundance. In the peasant cottage, laughter is rarer, harder won, treasured when it comes. The ability to laugh, to find joy despite circumstances, might be the only wealth truly shared across the medieval social divide. As our journey through medieval winter draws to a close, let your mind drift back from those distant centuries to the warmth and safety of your own bed. Think for a moment of the countless generations who faced winter's fury with little more than straw, clay, and the warmth of community. Eleanor the shepherdess and millions like her, whose names history never recorded, who transformed mere survival into an art form. Tonight, as you rest in comfort unimaginable to our ancestors, you carry within you their legacy of resilience. The same ingenuity that filled straw ticks with precise care, that shared fire between neighbors, that found nourishment in wild herbs and comfort in communal song. These are not distant echoes, but part of the human story that leads directly to this moment. The contrasts we've explored, between cottage and manor, between plenty and want, between then and now, remind us that comfort has always been unevenly distributed. Yet perhaps the greatest warmth came not from noble fires or fur-lined robes, but from the simple acts of kindness. A shared ember, a recipe for hunger bread, hands working together to patch a neighbor's wall. So as sleep approaches, let the struggles of medieval winter fade into the gentle darkness. You are safe, you are warm, you are heir to centuries of human perseverance. The cold winds that once threatened life itself are now just whispers outside your window. And in that safety, in that warmth, you can finally rest. Sleep well, dear listener, and dream perhaps of spring,